Holly Ann Harvey and Sandra Ketchum. In the summer of 2004, 15-year-old Holly Ann Harvey was living with her grandparents in Fayetteville, Georgia. Holly had grown up in an environment without rules or discipline, doing as she pleased until her mother was imprisoned on charges earlier that year. The transition to her grandparents' home represented a dramatic shift. Carl and Sarah Collier were conservative Baptists who imposed strict boundaries on their granddaughter, making her feel trapped like a caged animal after years of freedom. Holly had developed a romantic relationship with 16-year-old Sandra Ketchum, known as Sandy. The grandparents disapproved of this relationship and had threatened to separate the girls. Holly had run away multiple times to be with Sandy, and each time she was brought back, the restrictions grew tighter. The tension in the household escalated throughout the summer. On August 2nd, 2004, the situation reached a breaking point. Holly and Sandy attacked Carl and Sarah Collier with kitchen knives from the home. Carl, who was 75 years old, sustained 15 stab wounds. Sarah, 74, was stabbed 20 times. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving both grandparents deceased in their home. Following the attack, the girls attempted to stage the scene to look like a burglary. They ransacked the house and took the grandparents' Chevrolet Blazer. A note was left at the scene, written in blood, reading "Kill, keys, money, jewelry," though Holly later admitted this was a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. The girls fled in the stolen vehicle, driving approximately 250 miles to Tybee Island, Georgia. Their freedom was short-lived. Beachgoers noticed the bloodied teenagers and called authorities. A high-speed chase ensued, and the girls were apprehended within hours of the incident. Police found marijuana and a bloody knife in the vehicle, providing immediate physical evidence linking them to the crime scene. The investigation revealed the motive behind the attacks. The grandparents had been viewed as obstacles standing between Holly and Sandy. Investigators documented that the girls had planned the incident to eliminate these obstacles to their relationship. Holly's history of instability and the sudden imposition of strict rules after years without boundaries contributed to her resentment. Blood spatter analysis at the crime scene confirmed the ferocity of the attack. The forensic evidence, combined with the physical items found in the vehicle and the girls' own statements, created an overwhelming case against them. Both faced the possibility of the most severe penalty available under Georgia law. In 2005, both girls accepted plea agreements to avoid facing capital punishment. Holly was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 20 additional years. Sandy received 3 life sentences, with 2 running concurrently and 1 consecutively. The sentences ensured both would spend decades in prison before any possibility of release. During the court proceedings, both expressed remorse for their actions. Holly stated in court, "I'm sorry for what I did. I miss them." Sandy expressed similar sentiments, saying she wished she could take back what they had done. However, the severity of the crime meant these statements did little to affect their sentences. Holly appealed her sentence in 2007, claiming ineffective counsel, but the Georgia Supreme Court upheld the original sentence. The court found no merit in her arguments and determined that the original proceedings had been conducted properly. The case became a subject of study and discussions about juvenile offenders and the factors that lead teenagers to commit such acts. Holly's transition from an environment without structure to one with strict rules, combined with her romantic attachment to Sandy and the grandparents' opposition, created a volatile situation that ended in tragedy. As of 2025, both Holly and Sandy remain incarcerated in Georgia prisons, with no indication of imminent parole. They have served more than 2 decades of their sentences, and neither has been granted early release consideration. The case continues to be referenced in discussions about teenage offenders and appropriate sentencing for juveniles who commit serious crimes. The next case would unfold over a dispute that seemed trivial, until it turned deadly. Cretia Beyonce Stroud. In April 2024, in Gateshead, England, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Cretia Beyonce Stroud orchestrated an attack that would shock the community. The dispute at the center of the case began over a dog, a conflict that had been simmering between Stroud and 40-year-old Gary Belfield. What started as a neighborhood disagreement would escalate into something far more serious. Rather than resolving the dispute through normal channels, Stroud recruited two older teenagers to help her confront Belfield. Leandro Lopes, 18, and Jordan Tams, 19, agreed to participate in what Stroud had planned. The level of organization she demonstrated suggested this was not an impulsive act, but a calculated response to the ongoing conflict. On the night of the attack, the group went to Belfield's residence. Gary Belfield was stabbed 11 times during the confrontation. His son, Luke Williams, was also attacked but survived his injuries. The severity of the assault left Belfield with fatal wounds, and he passed away as a result of the attack. The investigation moved quickly. CCTV footage captured the attack, providing crucial evidence about what had occurred and who was involved. The surveillance recordings allowed investigators to identify the participants and understand the sequence of events. All three teenagers were arrested and charged. The forensic examination of Belfield's injuries documented the 11 stab wounds that caused his death. The medical evidence, combined with the video footage and witness statements, built a comprehensive case against Stroud and her co-defendants. Despite her age, prosecutors argued that Stroud's role in organizing the attack warranted serious consequences. The trial proceeded in early 2025. Evidence presented showed that Stroud had been the organizing force behind the attack, using the older teenagers to carry out her plan. The jury heard testimony about the dispute over the dog and how it had escalated from a neighborhood conflict into a lethal confrontation. All three defendants were convicted. On January 30th, 2025, Stroud was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years before she would be eligible to apply for parole. Her co-defendants received similar sentences, reflecting the court's view of the severity of their actions. The case took an unexpected turn in October 2025 when Jordan Tams died while in prison. The circumstances surrounding his death were not immediately disclosed, but it added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating case. For Gary Belfield's family, the sentences provided some measure of justice, though nothing could restore what they had lost. The case highlighted how seemingly minor disputes could escalate when combined with poor judgment and the involvement of multiple participants willing to take extreme action. Stroud remains incarcerated in the United Kingdom, where she will serve her sentence until at least her mid-30s before becoming eligible to seek release. The minimum term of 19 years means she will spend her entire youth and young adulthood in prison for her role in organizing the attack. The case drew significant media attention in the United Kingdom due to the age of the primary organizer and the seemingly disproportionate cause of the conflict. A dispute over a dog leading to a fatal stabbing illustrated how quickly situations could spiral out of control when teenagers made decisions to escalate rather than de-escalate. For investigators and prosecutors, the case demonstrated the challenges of dealing with juvenile offenders who organize others to commit serious crimes. Stroud's age meant she could not receive the same sentence as adult offenders. Yet her role in planning and directing the attack showed a level of premeditation typically associated with older perpetrators. What drives someone to turn against their own family? Trinity Shockley. In February 2025, 18-year-old Trinity Shockley was arrested in Mooresville, Indiana, for planning what authorities described as a potential mass incident at her former high school. Investigators discovered that Shockley had been planning what she referred to as Parkland Part 2, referencing a previous tragedy. The plot was scheduled to take place on Valentine's Day. The investigation began after a tip was received through a dedicated reporting hotline. This early warning allowed authorities to intervene before any harm could occur. The tip directed investigators to examine Shockley's online communications, where they discovered the extent of her planning. Discord chats revealed detailed planning for the intended attack on Mooresville High School. Shockley had documented her intentions and discussed methods for carrying out the plan. The digital evidence provided investigators with a clear picture of what she had intended to do and how far her planning had progressed. Shockley was arrested before she could act on her plans. No weapons were recovered that would have allowed her to carry out the attack, but the evidence of conspiracy was substantial. Prosecutors charged her with conspiracy to commit mass harm, arguing that her detailed planning demonstrated serious intent rather than idle fantasy. Court documents indicated that Shockley is transgender, and some analysis suggested possible identity struggles or mental health issues may have contributed to her state of mind. However, these factors did not provide a legal defense against the charges she faced. The case proceeded through the Indiana court system. Shockley faced serious charges that carried significant potential penalties. The evidence from her online communications provided clear documentation of her intentions, making it difficult to argue that she had not seriously planned to cause harm. Shockley was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with 12 years to serve before becoming eligible for release. The sentence reflected the court's view that her conspiracy, while not carried out, represented a serious threat that warranted substantial punishment. Shockley remains incarcerated in Indiana, where she will serve her sentence. The case serves as both a warning about the serious consequences of planning such acts and an example of how intervention can prevent tragedy. Sometimes the legal system reaches unexpected conclusions. Lola Luna. In 2021, 16-year-old Lola Luna was involved in a fatal confrontation with another teenager in Bremerton, Washington. The incident resulted in the death of 16-year-old Sienna Puryear Tucker, and Luna was subsequently charged and convicted. However, the case would take multiple turns through the appeals process. According to court records, Luna arrived at the meeting with Puryear Tucker while concealing a knife behind her back. The two teenagers had arranged to meet, reportedly due to ongoing tensions between them. What happened next resulted in Puryear Tucker sustaining fatal stab wounds. Luna was arrested shortly after the incident and confessed to her involvement. She was charged, and her case proceeded through the Washington court system. During the trial, Luna's defense raised claims related to her own experiences with mistreatment, attempting to provide context for her actions on that day. The trial resulted in a conviction, and Luna was sentenced to serve time for her role in Puryear Tucker's death. The case appeared to be resolved, with Luna beginning to serve her sentence. However, her legal team continued to pursue appeals, arguing that problems with the trial warranted a new examination of the case. The appeals process examined various aspects of how the trial had been conducted and what evidence had been presented to the jury. Luna's attorneys argued that certain evidence should not have been admitted and that these errors had affected the outcome of the trial. In November 2025, the Washington Supreme Court made a significant ruling in Luna's case. The court vacated Luna's conviction, finding that faulty evidence had been used during her original trial. This decision did not declare Luna innocent, but rather determined that the trial had not been conducted properly. As of late 2025, Luna awaits either a retrial or potential release, depending on how prosecutors choose to proceed following the Supreme Court's decision. The case remains in legal limbo as the state determines its next steps. For the family of Sienna Puryear Tucker, the legal developments have added uncertainty to an already painful situation. The vacated conviction means the case may need to be relitigated, prolonging a process that has already stretched over several years. They have had to watch as legal proceedings continue without a final resolution. The Luna case illustrates the complexity of the appeals process and how convictions that seem settled can be overturned years later based on procedural or evidentiary issues. The Washington Supreme Court's decision focused not on Luna's guilt or innocence, but on whether the trial had been conducted fairly according to legal standards. Legal experts watching the case noted that vacated convictions do not mean the defendant is found innocent. Rather, they indicate that something went wrong during the original trial that required correction. Prosecutors must now decide whether to retry Luna with new proceedings or whether to pursue other options. The next case would involve a hidden pregnancy and a desperate act. Chloe Coplin Anderson. In November 2023, in Gordon, Nebraska, 15-year-old Chloe Coplin Anderson gave birth alone in her bedroom. What happened next would result in charges that carried the potential for decades in prison. Anderson had experienced a troubled home life, suffering from PTSD and depression related to family circumstances. Throughout her pregnancy, no adults had intervened to help her. The pregnancy had been hidden from those around her. Anderson had not received prenatal care and had not prepared for the birth. When she went into labor, she was alone in her room, facing a situation she had apparently tried to avoid acknowledging for months. Following the birth, Anderson harmed her newborn son, using a knife that was later found in her closet. The infant did not survive. The incident was discovered when Anderson's condition required medical attention, leading to questions about what had happened. The investigation uncovered the sequence of events. Forensic examination of the scene documented what had occurred. Anderson's parents provided statements to police as the investigation proceeded. Her father initially believed the infant had been stillborn before the full circumstances became known. Anderson was charged with serious offenses related to the infant's death. The case raised difficult questions about mental health, hidden pregnancies, and the failures of support systems that might have intervened earlier. Her defense team highlighted her age and the trauma she had experienced, arguing for consideration of these factors in sentencing. The court proceedings examined Anderson's background, including the circumstances that had led to her mental health struggles. Evidence was presented about her experiences and the lack of adult intervention during her pregnancy. However, the severity of what had occurred limited the mitigation these factors could provide. In April 2024, Anderson was sentenced to 35 to 60 years in prison. The sentence means she will not be eligible for release until she is in her early 50s at the earliest. The court determined that despite her age and background, the nature of the offense required substantial punishment. Anderson is currently incarcerated in Nebraska, where she will serve her sentence. The case highlighted failures at multiple levels. The systems that did not identify a troubled teenager in crisis, the hidden pregnancy that went unaddressed, and the tragic outcome that resulted. For those who knew Anderson, the case represented the culmination of problems that had been building for years without adequate intervention. The sentence ensures she will spend most of her adult life in prison, with release not possible until she has served at least 35 years. Another case would involve someone who had already experienced the foster care system. Nicole Jackson. In June 2021, 14-year-old Nicole Jackson and a 12-year-old accomplice broke into a home in Enterprise, Florida. Jackson had a troubled history in the foster care system and had run away from a children's home. What followed would be one of the most alarming incidents involving juvenile offenders that year. The two girls broke into the residence and obtained weapons from inside the home. When Volusia County deputies responded to the break-in, the girls opened fire using an AK-47 and other firearms. The shootout lasted several minutes, with the girls firing multiple rounds at law enforcement officers attempting to resolve the situation. Body cam footage captured audio of Jackson stating, "I'm gonna kill them all," during the confrontation. The recording documented the intensity of the situation and the apparent mindset of the participants. Deputies returned fire during the exchange, and one of the girls was wounded before both were taken into custody. Remarkably, no deputies or bystanders were harmed fatally during the incident, though the potential for tragedy was clear given the weapons involved and the duration of the exchange. Jackson's accomplice, being only 12 years old, faced a separate legal process due to her age. The investigation examined how the girls had ended up in this situation. Both were runaways who had been staying away from their assigned placements. The motive appeared to be thrill-seeking behavior combined with a desire to avoid returning to the system. The break-in and subsequent confrontation represented an extreme escalation. Jackson was charged as an adult due to the severity of the offenses, including attempted harm to law enforcement officers. During the legal proceedings, she rejected a plea deal that would have resulted in a 20-year sentence, apparently hoping for a better outcome at trial. In an unusual development, a couple who had followed the case offered to adopt Jackson before her sentencing, believing she could be rehabilitated with proper support. The court ultimately did not accept this arrangement. Jackson was sentenced in 2023 to 20 years in a juvenile facility, the same term she had rejected in the earlier plea deal. The sentence means she will remain in custody well into her 30s before becoming eligible for release. Jackson remains in the Florida juvenile system. The case highlighted serious questions about the foster care system, intervention for troubled youth, and how quickly situations can escalate when vulnerable young people have access to weapons. The incident became a subject of national attention due to the young ages of the participants and the intensity of the confrontation with law enforcement. Video footage from the scene showed the extent of the exchange and the danger that deputies faced in responding to the call. Child welfare advocates used the case to argue for better support systems for youth, foster care, and more resources for intervening before troubled teenagers reach crisis points. Jackson's history of running away and her behavior during the incident suggested a young person who had been failed by multiple systems meant to protect and guide her. The offer of adoption that emerged during the legal proceedings highlighted the debate over rehabilitation versus punishment for juvenile offenders. The couple who offered to take Jackson believed that with proper support and structure, she could become a productive member of society. However, the court determined that the severity of her actions required incarceration. For the deputies who responded to the call that day, the incident represented one of the most dangerous situations they had faced. Their training allowed them to resolve the standoff without any fatalities, but the potential for a much worse outcome was evident throughout the confrontation. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would take place in New York City, involving wealth, substances, and an act that shocked even hardened investigators. Daphne Abdallah. On May 22, 1997, in Central Park, Manhattan, 15-year-old Daphne Abdallah and her 15-year-old boyfriend, Christopher Vasquez, encountered 44-year-old Michael McMorrow near the Strawberry Fields Memorial area. Abdallah had been adopted as an infant by wealthy parents. Her father, Angelo, was a successful businessman, and her mother, Catherine, was a former model. The family lived in a luxury apartment on the Upper West Side overlooking Central Park itself. Despite the privileged environment, Abdallah had a history of behavioral problems. She had been expelled from multiple private schools for belligerence and was known for causing problems wherever she went. Her parents had considered sending her to boarding school to address her conduct issues. At the time of the incident, she was romantically involved with Vasquez, whom she had met in the neighborhood. McMorrow was a real estate agent who frequented Central Park. On the night in question, he was drinking near the lake when he encountered the two teenagers. According to court testimony and investigation records, McMorrow provided alcohol and LSD to the teenagers during their encounter. The three spent time together in the park as the evening progressed. At some point, the encounter turned deadly. McMorrow was stabbed more than 30 times with a knife. But the attack did not stop there. His throat was slashed, and his body was gutted. His intestines were cut out in an apparent attempt to make the body sink when it was thrown into the Central Park Lake. The mutilation was so severe that investigators initially struggled to identify the remains. The body was discovered floating in the lake on May 23rd. The condition of the corpse immediately indicated this was not a typical homicide. Medical examiners documented over 30 stab wounds, plus the extensive post-mortem mutilation. The investigation launched a search for witnesses who might have seen anything unusual in the park. Forensic teams recovered bloody clothing and a knife from the area that yielded DNA evidence. Witnesses came forward who had seen two teenagers in the park that evening, providing descriptions that matched Abdallah and Vasquez. Fingerprint evidence connected both to items found at the scene. Within days, police had identified their suspects and made arrests. During police interrogation, Abdallah made statements that would become infamous. She confessed to her role in mutilating McMorrow's body, telling investigators, "I just gutted him like a fish." Her matter-of-fact description of the mutilation shocked the detectives conducting the interview. She provided details about how the attack unfolded and the respective roles each teenager played. The investigation determined that Vasquez had been the primary attacker, inflicting the majority of the stab wounds. Abdallah's role centered on the mutilation and disposal of the body. Prosecutors established that after McMorrow was already dead or dying, Abdallah participated in cutting open his abdomen. The theory was that removing his intestines would allow gases to escape, preventing the body from floating to the surface of the lake. The motive appeared to be a combination of thrill-seeking and the effects of the substances consumed that evening. There was speculation about a robbery element, but no clear financial motive was established. McMorrow had money on him that was taken, but whether this was the original intent or an afterthought remained unclear. The trial in 1998 generated intense media coverage. The contrast between Abdallah's wealthy Upper West Side background and the savagery of the crime fascinated the press. Reporters detailed her expensive private school education and her family's social standing while describing the brutality of what had been done to McMorrow. Abdallah was sentenced to 3 1/3 to 10 years in prison for first-degree manslaughter. Vasquez, as the primary attacker, received a longer sentence for second-degree murder. The disparity reflected the court's finding that while Abdallah participated in the mutilation, Vasquez bore primary responsibility for the actual killing. Abdallah was released in 2004 after serving approximately 6 years. She returned to the New York area where her parents still resided. In 2009, she was involved in a car accident that caused injuries to others, but otherwise has avoided public attention. She changed her appearance and has lived quietly since her release. As of 2025, she would be in her early 40s. The case earned Abdallah a media nickname based on the brutality of the mutilation. McMorrow's family was devastated by both his death and the manner in which his body had been treated. Vasquez was released from prison in 2019 after serving over 20 years. The two have not been publicly linked since their release. What method could a 13-year-old use that required such deliberate planning? Christina Adkins. In 2006, in Lenawee County, Michigan, 13-year-old Christina Adkins was living with her 53-year-old grandmother, Virginia Bentley. The arrangement was common in families where parents were unable to provide care, and Bentley had taken on the responsibility of raising her granddaughter. The household dynamic would become central to understanding what occurred. Adkins obtained morphine, a powerful opioid painkiller, and administered it to her grandmother. The method of obtaining the substance was examined during the investigation. Morphine is a controlled medication typically available only through prescription. How a 13-year-old gained access to it raised questions about whether it had been present in the home for legitimate medical purposes or obtained through other means. Bentley died from the morphine overdose. The toxicology report during the autopsy revealed the presence of the opioid at lethal levels. Medical examiners ruled the death a homicide rather than an accidental overdose based on the circumstances and the amount of substance administered. The investigation then focused on who had access and opportunity. Adkins was questioned by investigators about her grandmother's death. She provided statements to police that became central to the case, though her defense attorneys later challenged whether these statements should be admissible. The defense argued that a 13-year-old being questioned about such serious allegations required specific protections that may not have been fully observed. The courts heard arguments on both sides regarding the confession's admissibility. Ultimately, judges ruled that Adkins's statements could be used as evidence, rejecting the defense challenge. This ruling meant prosecutors could present her own words to establish what had happened. The specific motive for the poisoning was never definitively established in public court records. Prosecutors presented evidence about the circumstances, but the underlying reason why Adkins decided to administer morphine to her grandmother remained somewhat unclear. The deliberate nature of the act, obtaining the substance and giving it to Bentley, indicated this was not accidental or impulsive. Adkins was held in juvenile detention while the case proceeded through the Michigan court system. The legal process took approximately 2 years as both sides prepared arguments and negotiated potential outcomes. Her age at the time of the offense, just 13, complicated questions about appropriate charging and sentencing. In 2008, when Adkins had turned 16, she pleaded guilty to second-degree charges in connection with her grandmother's death. The plea agreement resolved the case without requiring a full trial. By pleading guilty, Adkins acknowledged responsibility for what had occurred. During the sentencing hearing, Adkins offered an apology to the court. She expressed regret for her actions, though whether this reflected genuine remorse or was part of the legal proceedings' expectations was left for observers to interpret. The court had to weigh her age against the premeditated nature of a poisoning. Adkins was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 20 years. This sentence structure meant she would become eligible for parole consideration around 2028, when she would be in her mid-30s. The sentence balanced the severity of the crime against her young age, providing the possibility of eventual release while ensuring she would spend her formative years incarcerated. As of 2025, there has been no public reporting confirming whether she remains incarcerated or has had any parole hearings. Her case file would be reviewed by the parole board when her eligibility date arrives, with factors including her conduct while imprisoned and any rehabilitation programs completed being considered. The poisoning method set this case apart from typical juvenile offenses. Stabbing or shooting in a moment of rage differs significantly from obtaining a controlled substance and administering a fatal dose. The deliberation required suggested a level of planning that prosecutors emphasized in arguing for a substantial sentence despite her young age. Virginia Bentley was remembered by family members as someone who had taken on the responsibility of raising her granddaughter when others could not. That she became the victim of the very person she was trying to help added a layer of tragedy to the case. The trust inherent in a grandparent-grandchild relationship made the betrayal all the more disturbing to investigators and prosecutors. How does a group of teenagers plan an ambush that ends in death? Charlie K. Ely. On April 17, 2011, in Summerfield, Florida, 18-year-old Charlie K. Ely participated in a coordinated attack that resulted in the death of 15-year-old Seath Jackson. Ely had been born in Marion County on July 11, 1992, and grew up in the area. By the time of the incident, she was living independently after marrying Joseph Burham in 2010 at age 18. Ely's residence had become a gathering spot for local teenagers, a place where they could congregate without parental supervision. This environment contributed to the circumstances that led to Jackson's death. The dispute at the center of the case involved romantic relationships within the social circle. Jackson had been dating a girl connected to the group, creating tensions. The plan involved luring Jackson to a specific location under false pretenses. Once he arrived, he was ambushed by multiple participants, including Michael Bargo, Kyle Hooper, and others. Ely's role involved helping organize the ambush and facilitating access to the location where it would occur. Jackson was beaten and shot by members of the group. The attack was prolonged and brutal. Jackson was struck multiple times before being shot. After Jackson was dead, the participants attempted to dispose of evidence and the body. They burned his remains in a fire pit and scattered the ashes. The crime scene extended across multiple locations as the group tried to cover their tracks. But forensic investigators were eventually able to piece together what had occurred. The investigation began when Jackson was reported missing. Tips led police to examine the group around Ely's residence. One of the co-defendants eventually provided information to investigators, breaking the wall of silence and revealing what had occurred. This cooperation allowed police to piece together the sequence of events. Forensic evidence, including DNA, was recovered from the scene where Jackson was attacked. Weapons used in the assault were located. Physical evidence combined with the co-defendant's statements built a comprehensive case against all participants. Each faced charges based on their specific role in the planning and execution of the attack. During legal proceedings, Ely testified on the stand and admitted that she had known Jackson might not survive the encounter. This admission was damaging to her defense, as it demonstrated awareness of the potential consequences of the plan. She could not claim ignorance about what was being organized. Background testimony included statements from Ely's grandmother about difficulties in her upbringing. Defense attorneys attempted to provide context for how Ely had ended up involved in such a situation. However, the evidence of her participation was substantial enough that mitigation arguments had limited effect. Ely was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Michael Bargo, identified as the primary shooter, was sentenced to death. Other participants received varying sentences based on their roles. The case appeared closed, with all defendants facing decades of incarceration or execution. However, years later, Ely's legal team filed appeals arguing that she had received ineffective assistance of counsel during her original trial. They identified specific failures in how her defense had been conducted. The courts reviewed these arguments and ultimately agreed that the representation had been constitutionally deficient. Ely's conviction was vacated based on the ineffective counsel finding. Rather than face a new trial, she negotiated a plea to reduced second-degree charges. She was released in 2020 after the plea was accepted. Since her release, Ely has been living in Lakeland, Florida. She has maintained a low profile and avoided media attention. Meanwhile, Bargo remains on death row awaiting execution, and other co-defendants continue serving their sentences. Jackson's family has expressed frustration that one participant walks free while their son remains gone. The case highlighted the complexities of group crimes involving multiple participants with different levels of involvement. While Ely did not personally deliver the fatal blows, her role in organizing the ambush made her culpable. The appeals process focused not on her innocence, but on whether she had received adequate legal representation, a distinction that provided cold comfort to the victim's family. What happens when war trauma follows a child across the ocean? Sofia Koval. On May 23, 2024, in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida, 14-year-old Sofia Koval attacked and caused the death of her 79-year-old grandmother, Yevgenia Koval. Sofia had recently arrived in the United States from Ukraine, separated from her mother due to the ongoing conflict in that country. Her grandmother had taken her in, providing a home in South Florida while war continued in her homeland. Since arriving in America, Sofia had displayed behavioral issues that family members and officials attributed to war-related trauma. The transition from a conflict zone to a new country, combined with separation from her mother, had created psychological challenges. Documentation indicated that Sofia had been struggling to adjust, though the extent of intervention she received was unclear. The fatal confrontation began when Yevgenia took Sofia's phone away. What might have been an ordinary disciplinary moment between grandparent and grandchild escalated into something far more serious. Sofia reacted to the loss of the phone with physical aggression that proved fatal. Sofia used objects available in the home as weapons, including her grandmother's walker and a belt. The walker, a medical device meant to help the elderly woman move around, became an instrument of harm. The belt was used to strike repeatedly. The 79-year-old woman sustained bruises, abrasions, and injuries from the assault. Yevgenia Koval did not survive the attack. Emergency responders arrived at the Lauderdale Lakes residence after receiving a call about the incident. They found the 79-year-old woman's body with visible injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. Sofia was present at the scene when police arrived and was taken into custody by Broward County Sheriff's deputies. Crime scene investigators documented the items used in the attack and photographed the injuries to establish what had occurred. During questioning, Sofia made statements to investigators about what had occurred. Speaking with detectives at the Broward County Sheriff's Office, she admitted to hitting her grandmother with the belt during the confrontation. More disturbingly, she made comments about having helped her die, a statement suggesting awareness that her actions would be fatal or had already proven fatal. These admissions, made during the initial investigation, became key evidence in building the case against her. Sofia was charged and initially entered a not guilty plea. Her defense raised the possibility of self-defense, suggesting that the grandmother may have been the aggressor. However, given the physical disparity between a 14-year-old and a 79-year-old using a walker, this argument faced skepticism. As the case proceeded, Sofia's father indicated support for a plea agreement that would resolve the matter. The defense strategy shifted from contesting the charges to negotiating an outcome. Sofia withdrew her not guilty plea and accepted responsibility for her grandmother's death. In October 2024, Sofia was sentenced to 3 years in a juvenile detention program. Following completion of that program, she would remain under supervision until reaching age 21. The sentence was considerably lighter than what an adult would receive for causing the death of an elderly family member, reflecting the juvenile justice system's focus on rehabilitation for young offenders rather than purely punitive measures. However, Sofia's legal situation extends beyond the criminal sentence. Following her release, she faces likely deportation back to Ukraine. This means returning to a country still experiencing active conflict, the same conditions she fled. Her future remains uncertain, caught between the American legal system and the ongoing war in her homeland. The case raised difficult questions about how to help young refugees dealing with war trauma integrate into new environments. Sophia had been showing warning signs before the fatal incident, yet intervention was either unavailable or inadequate. Her grandmother had offered her home as a safe haven, only to become a casualty of the very trauma Sophia had brought with her from Ukraine. Yevgenia Koval was 79 years old, using a walker to get around her home. She had taken in her granddaughter to provide stability and safety during wartime. Instead, the objects meant to help her, the walker, items around her home, became the instruments of her death at the hands of the child she was trying to protect. What happens when an everyday object becomes a lethal weapon? Rebecca Douglas. In May 2011, in London, England, 15-year-old Rebecca Douglas attacked 16-year-old Julie Sheriff during a confrontation between the two girls. Douglas had been living an unstable life in the period before the incident, moving between friends' houses rather than staying in a permanent home. This transient existence meant limited adult supervision and structure. The two girls had an ongoing dispute. The conflict had escalated over time, though the specific origins were not fully detailed in public court records. What is known is that on the day of the incident, another argument occurred that turned physical. Douglas used an afro comb as a weapon. This was not a typical plastic comb, but one with a metal handle designed for styling thick, textured hair. The metal portion ended in a point that, when driven with force, could penetrate tissue. Douglas used this pointed metal end to strike Sheriff in the head. The metal penetrated Sheriff's skull, causing catastrophic brain injury. The pointed end of the metal handle had been driven with enough force to puncture bone and damage the brain tissue beneath. The wound was severe enough that Sheriff lost consciousness immediately and fell into a coma. Emergency services transported her to hospital, where doctors assessed the damage and determined the injury was life-threatening. Sheriff remained in a coma for 5 months. During this extended period, her family maintained a bedside vigil at the hospital, hoping against the medical prognosis for signs of recovery. Doctors monitored her brain activity and vital signs daily, while investigators continued building their case against Douglas. The legal proceedings had to account for the possibility that Sheriff might recover, which would affect what charges could be brought. When Sheriff died without regaining consciousness, the case became a homicide rather than an assault causing grievous bodily harm. Douglas, who had been charged with the lesser offense while Sheriff remained alive, now faced the more serious charge of causing death. The 5-month delay between attack and death did not diminish her responsibility under English law. The original assault had set in motion the chain of events that led to Sheriff's passing. The investigation gathered multiple forms of evidence. Forensic analysis of the wound matched the dimensions of the comb's metal handle. A mobile phone recording from the scene captured portions of what occurred, providing documentation beyond witness testimony. Physical evidence from the scene corroborated the sequence of events. Douglas was arrested and held while the legal process continued. Her unstable living situation before the attack became part of the background presented to the court, though it did not provide a defense for what she had done. The prosecution argued that using the metal end of the comb demonstrated intent to cause serious harm. Sheriff's father spoke publicly about his grief and anger following his daughter's death. He blamed the decision to move the family to the United Kingdom, believing Julie would have been safer in their previous country. The 5 months of watching his daughter in a coma before her death had compounded his anguish. In August 2012, Douglas was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 10 years. The life sentence meant she would remain under supervision indefinitely, even if eventually released. The 10-year minimum established the earliest point at which she could apply for parole. Under this sentence structure, Douglas became eligible for parole consideration around 2022. However, there has been no public confirmation of whether she has been released or remains incarcerated. Parole eligibility does not guarantee release. The parole board must determine that the offender no longer poses a risk to public safety. The case became known for the unusual weapon involved. An afro comb is a common grooming tool found in homes across the world. That such an everyday object could cause fatal injury when used with violent intent demonstrated how quickly ordinary situations can become deadly. Sheriff's death over a teenage argument, caused by a hairstyling implement, underscored the randomness of how some lives are lost. Julie Sheriff was 16 years old when she was attacked, and she spent the final 5 months of her life in a coma, never regaining consciousness. Her family watched and waited, hoping for recovery that never came. When she finally passed, they had already been grieving for months. Douglas's unstable living situation before the crime, bouncing between friends' houses without a permanent home, meant she lacked the adult guidance that might have helped her manage conflict without resorting to aggression. Whether she has since received the support and structure she was missing remains unknown, as does whether she remains behind bars or has rejoined society. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.